All right, thanks everybody. So we are going to be talking a little bit more about resilience, imagine that. I am Diana Yassani. I have a woman-owned small business called Parasol Health Consulting. And before that I was with the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So public health preparedness and response for a long, long time. And I'm really very fortunate, and so are you, to have a fantastic panel this morning. Next to me is Pepper Natonsky, Vice President of Federal Government Affairs at Duke Energy. Jonathan George is the Foundation Lead at PepsiCo. Renee Data is the Vice President of Corporate Giving at Prudential. And then Mayor Belinda Constant from Gretna, Louisiana. So thanks for joining us. So we've talked a lot this morning, everybody has talked a lot about the complexities of responses and of preparedness and how there are multifaceted responses at this point. Also, public-private partnerships and partnerships in general become more complicated, and it becomes more important to find win-win situations. How can communities and government and the private sector and nonprofits find those win-win scenarios? So articulating that importance and is really an important thing, but what we want to talk about, what this panel is going to talk about, is the how. So not just that it's complicated, but also how is it actually happening in the field. So this group is doing something about that. And I want to start with a basic question for everybody, and that is, how is your organization working with communities to build their resilience? Simple as that. Pepper, let's start with you.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you. At Duke Energy, our value really rests on providing reliable and safe power to our customers every day, 24/7. And so our communities can thrive when we are providing that very essential and reliable service. When you think about resiliency for our industry, you probably think of a term or investments that we're making in a traditional sense, right? Around, say, grid improvements and grid investments. And we're doing a lot of that. We are taking a look at our areas that are hit the hardest, right? So you think about coastal areas, places with marshes, areas like this. We take a look at where the critical infrastructure that we own sits in those vulnerable areas, and we make investments such as moving from wood poles to steel poles, or doing targeted undergrounding where it makes sense in those communities. So that's resiliency in a traditional sense for our industry. But for us, resiliency also means things like workforce development with respect to human capital management. It means economic development. We partner with our communities to try to bring businesses to the areas we serve. That can really help areas, especially that are underserved. In 2022 alone, we brought on 89 new projects at $23 billion in capital investment. So working with the communities to attract new employers and businesses is also part of resiliency.
Renee?
Yes, at Prudential, our purpose is to solve the financial challenges of our changing world, a big undertaking for us. And so I sit on the foundation, the Prudential Foundation, and we invest about $50 million in corporate contributions and grants, working with low and to moderate income communities. And we do that by focusing on what we call work and wealth, making sure that people have opportunities for work and building wealth, which is part of building their resilience. And our inclusive communities work, which is based on our work in Newark, New Jersey, our home for over 150 years. In addition to that, we know that a disaster and emergency can push people's financial being into turmoil. So we have set aside a separate bucket of money for disaster response. And part of the response includes working with organizations like Team Rubicon, who's on the House, who does not only immediate relief, but also recovery efforts. We also have an impact investments team, and they do program-related investments and other investments, and many of them have this infrastructure development type of work to make sure that communities are ready to respond.
Jonathan?
Great. Thank you so much, Diana. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's so good to be here in DC. I just saw so many of my partners come in, so it's great to have that reunion. So as Diana was mentioning, I work at the PepsiCo Foundation. I lead our philanthropic efforts in North America, in the US and Canada. And primarily for the PepsiCo Foundation, how we drive resilience in communities through three of our sort of strategic drivers. The first is safe water access. We have a lot of efforts around distribution, purification, as well as conservation. We really hone in on food security efforts. So we have a program, a social enterprise within PepsiCo called Food for Good that looks at how do we help provide nutrition and access to nutrition to kids when they're out of school. And then we also help with farming communities, specifically provide nutrition for them. And then lastly, it's through economic opportunity. So we have scholarship programs, we have small business support, as well as a nonprofit leader program as well that we have recently started. But in all that, there's sort of a framework that we operate within the foundation that's really important. So we're trying not to be just check writers. I love writing checks, write them all day. But we try to be more than just check writers, how we really change makers in the community. And to do that, we drive that through our 3 L's. So the first is we try to make sure that we're very local in our efforts and how we support, that it's not just us coming to a community saying this is how things need to be done, but really how do we co-create with partners, because we know that every community is different. Second, that it's leading, that these are transformative partnerships and they're innovative solutions that we're bringing. We're PepsiCo, we've got a saying, we go big or go home. So we try to lead in the way that we do it. And then lastly, that it's actually lasting, that it's actually sustainable impact that we're having through the investments that we're making within the community. So in philanthropy, there's a saying, back in the day, we used to do what they call the spray and pray. Just give some money and you hope something good happens, but really, we're trying to be more strategic in the investments that we're making that can really make communities more resilient and really support communities in that way.
Great. So speaking of communities, same question to you, Meg.
Yes, as mayor of a small community like the city of Gretna, Louisiana, in fact, August 1 starts peak hurricane season for our state. But it is our responsibility, my responsibility as mayor, to collaborate with agencies and other governmental offices, as well as private contractors, also nonprofit organizations, to ensure that we are storm ready, disaster ready, never knowing what the disaster is going to be. For us, most of the time it's flooding and hurricanes. However, we had the first tornado to hit our area in December of last year, which is pretty unprecedented for us. So as a local mayor, it's about being responsive to the constituents at the top level possible.
I'd love to stick with you on that and talk a little bit about this major accomplishment that you helped. So with large bipartisan support, the STORM Act was passed and funded at $500 million as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. You were a big part of that, Mayor Gretna. So what effect will this law have on resilience at the local level? And how is this new tool different than other options that are currently available for local government?
Okay, so I can speak to that from two positions. I'm here not just as the mayor of the city of Gretna, but also as the Louisiana State Chair for MRCTI, which is the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. I am also the corporate chair of that organization. But for the city of Gretna, it's transformative. As a municipal government in a parish in the state of Louisiana, most of state funding or federal funding never comes directly to the city of Gretna. It comes to the state through the parish, and what's left of that trickle, I pray I get a piece of. This kind of transforms that for a city. But also, MRCTI, I want you to know, was the first non-federal author of the STORM Act. So it's something we're pretty proud of. And working with our partners, with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and receiving the funding for this innovative piece of legislation is transformative for not just myself, but for the 104 mayors along the Mississippi River and 10 states. The organization itself gives us the ability as mayors to come together with many, many different types of disaster conversations, but understanding that whatever impacts Bemidji also gravely impacts New Orleans and the city of Gretna. So we are excited about the collaboration that MRCTI offers so that in 2023, regionalization is something we talk about. We talked about that decades ago. Today we talk about globalization, and we all know that what happens in one place truly affects someone else, maybe in different ways. And the STORM Act has given us the ability to distribute money in a way that's probably best for all entities, because everybody has the ability to say what the need is or draw down for their specific need. But the localization piece of that, for me, is tremendous as a local mayor.
Thank you. That's great. And I want to talk a little bit about the corporate investments, but also that community reach that Duke has. So what success have you had, your organization, in developing resilient systems in coordination with governments at multiple levels?
Thank you. When we think about system planning, we prepare for present needs, but we also increasingly look to our future needs. And to pull on a thread that the mayor discussed, I think federal policy, there's a real opportunity to connect our local communities, our states that we serve, with the policies that have been signed into law. I'll echo the comments on the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. We're working very closely with our states to secure funding for some mutual resilience goals that we have. For example, in South Carolina, there's an opportunity for what's called self-healing technology. And this is where you can reroute power if there's a disruption in service at some point on the grid. So think about this in a similar way that you think about the GPS in your car. If they see that there's an accident, it reroutes you and takes you a different path, right? You can avoid that area of concern. A self-healing grid, electric grid, is very similar. We can reroute power. So we're working in South Carolina on tech to give access through funding through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act for technology like that. There's also opportunities in South Carolina and Ohio that we're working through with respect to battery storage. This is a really great opportunity to ensure that we can maintain reliable power, especially in areas in some of those communities where we cannot build new, say, distribution or transmission lines. So battery storage has a really great opportunity, I think, to serve several of our communities. In addition to federal policy, I'd also like to flag one more. There's the LIHEAP funding opportunity. This is the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. This is really helpful federal program that supports vulnerable customers and customers in need. And so working with our community partners at the state level, local level, and the nonprofits that are in the area to really educate those areas that these funds are available for their assistance can be really impactful to homes and to families. I would also say public-private partnerships are really helpful. I can think of two examples for you. One is through the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council. This is a really great tool that is principle-driven. So you have representatives from DHS, DOE, you have CEOs from all of the large utilities when there is a disaster coming that we know about, right? Say a hurricane. These principals quickly mobilize, they share information that helps prepare for the storm or event, and then they regularly stay in contact throughout the event, and then also discuss areas for improvement after a natural disaster. The other is what's called GridX, and this is NERC's, what we like to call the largest grid exercise in North America. It happens every 2 years, and EISEC members can participate in this grid exercise, and it's really helpful because in real time you're preparing for an event, and you can, after the fact, you can do some information sharing with other members about and share best practices about what was learned, were there any gaps, and it just helps make us stronger after we have an opportunity to really drill in a real-time way for these types of events. And then finally, I would say, as Jonathan mentioned, sometimes financial support is also very helpful. So our foundation also works, the Duke Energy Foundation works very closely with nonprofits on resiliency grants for areas that really need it to prepare for and respond to events.
So, Jonathan, how does PepsiCo use some of your unique capabilities to support communities both prior and during disasters?
Sure, thanks, Diana. So at PepsiCo, we're the second largest food and beverage company. Our products are consumed 1 billion times each day. So for us, it's really about how do we really tap into that capability that PepsiCo has that knows how to make, move, sell products into every corner of stores all across the globe. How can we really tap into that unique capability to support communities? So the way that that's come to life at the PepsiCo Foundation has been through our Food for Good social enterprise within our foundation that looks at how do we source, procure, and package meals for kids in communities that are in need. And we've actually been able to lift and shift that for our disaster relief response as well. So when Hurricane Harvey hit, there was a huge need for shelf-stable meals. We were able to produce over 1 million meals utilizing PepsiCo's capabilities to be able to get that to communities in need. And since then, it's actually been a staple of our response. We've partnered with Team Rubicon during COVID. We've partnered with Save the Children, with World Central Kitchen to be able to get these meals out to communities that really need them. But in addition to that, our brands also play a very big role. Across sort of our Pepsi warehouses and manufacturing facilities, we have allocated inventory specifically for brands like Aquafina so that when disasters strike, especially looking at some of these communities that have been hit over and over again, how do we really make sure that we're absolutely ready to help and support with sort of the capabilities and support that we have both during disaster, but also preparing ahead of time so that communities can be more resilient and can have that support from us.
Renee, how has Prudential invested in communities to strengthen the capacity to respond to disasters and build resilience?
Well, thank you, Diana. So I want to tell you a story about Puerto Rico. As a proud Puerto Rican, I can tell you the banking industry in Puerto Rico is mainly driven through credit unions, or what we call cooperativas. And there are about 100 of them in Puerto Rico. None of them before Maria were community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, which meant that they were excluded from being able to access funding from other organizations. So I don't need to remind you that in 2017, Maria hit Puerto Rico, causing more than $90 billion in damage and the largest blackout in US history. So there was no electricity, there were no ATMs, there was no cash. It was these credit unions that were moving cash. We have heard stories of presidents of these credit unions driving motorcycles through the bridges and whatever was available to go through San Juan and get cash and bring it back to their communities. So they became that center. Some of them became the center for electricity, water, and sometimes food. So there's an organization called Inclusive that works with credit unions here in the United States. So shortly after Maria, they went to Puerto Rico. And they saw the need to create, to make sure that these credit unions had access to CDFI certification. So they did a couple of trainings, and shortly after Maria, they had hundreds of people attending a training. As you can imagine, getting a CDFI certification it's a process. But in 2018, there were a few. By 2019, there were a few that were able to get like about $3.7 million in CDFI money. In 2020, I had the opportunity of giving a grant. Now, for the grant makers in the room, this was the best grant I've ever made. It fell on my lap. It was a $125,000 investment, but it's the gift that keeps on giving. Because what it did is gave Inclusive the opportunity to expand that CDFI certification. So from having zero CDFI certified institutions, today we have 93 certified credit unions or cooperativas in Puerto Rico. But what does that mean? That means that in 2019, these 21 cooperativas were able to access about $675,000. So we were jumping out of joy. In 2020, they had 7.5 times more the funding, close to $6 million. By 2021, 10 times the amount of funding was available, and they reached almost $60 million. So $125,000 grant has translated to over $300 million brought back to the communities in Puerto Rico. That is for these credit unions to be able to do energy assistance loans, small business development. And in addition to that, they were able to move PPP loans for small businesses. And some of them now, at least one of them became like this, working with FEMA, one of the distribution centers, and they have built a new facility in the mountains of Puerto Rico where they have energy tanks, they have a kitchen, they will become that center, that distribution center for the center of the island. And now more and more of them are beginning to think about that. And I can say more later.
No, that's wonderful. And so we tend to gravitate in all of our conversations on the response side of it and what to do when the disaster happens. And I want to switch up a little bit and talk about that mitigation piece and the preparing piece. You know, in our closing time today, when we're doing fine on time, we're good. Let's get ahead of the disaster and disruption and the crisis. I think about, from a public health and healthcare standpoint, some of the recent drug shortages and manufacturing issues. Offshoring manufacturing. Also, we just lived through a pandemic, and there are more to come. We're worried on the public health side around vector-borne diseases, and the next outbreak is a plane ride away. And so I think about it from a public health standpoint, and how do we do that disease detection or the meteorology? We talked a little bit about that backstage, and knowing what's next, and how do your organizations think about that from the mitigation and readiness standpoint? So. Let's see, we'll mix it up a little bit. And I'll go to Renee, back to you.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Oh, yes, so it's what are the biggest opportunities for companies, but also communities, to prioritize, not just to be ready for the response, but to build that resilience, which you started talking about there, needed to decrease the impacts of the shocks when they come?
Sure. For us, it's again about investing in communities, in the people of the communities, and those grassroots organizations that are underground doing the work. So again, taking that example of the CDFI institutions, they were right now. There is a CDBG mitigation grants that were available for organizations in Puerto Rico. It was an $8.285 billion that were allocated for that, and 41 credit unions were able to access that money. 33 of them are focused on renewable energy. So they are beginning to build their capacity to do that. They're also able to work with AmeriCorps, with the Economic Mobility Corps, and now they're creating jobs for people to be able to work and continue to strengthen their capacity to address those needs. And now they're also attracting external investments. Deutsche Bank invested in one credit union, which created the first financial cooperativa renewable energy loan. For example. So again, it's investing in the people in the local communities at the grassroots level that we've seen the greatest investment.
That's great, thank you. Jonathan?
Yeah, Mary, I think I totally agree with you as far as I think so often we can focus on relief-related efforts, but I think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to support preparedness, especially a lot of the nonprofit organizations that are doing incredible work in making sure the pre-positioned supplies get ready. So for example, we're part of the American Red Cross ADGP, which helps to pre-position supplies and provide training, which is so necessary. Just recently, I think it was a few weeks ago, Matt Colvin and the team, Rubicon team, were kind enough to invite me to their Dallas Operations Center, where they did a simulated hurricane response. So we got to see sort of firsthand how they're bringing all these teams together so that they can be ready when the disaster strikes. And I think sometimes we don't invest enough in those initiatives. I think when relief happens, we were really quick to provide, but really thinking ahead of it and how can we be more strategic about it. And I think when you were talking about Puerto Rico, similarly in 2017, we supported a PADF on rebuilding some community centers, but this time we worked together to think about how do we make sure that these investments are not just for now, but how do we make sure they're more resilient moving forward. So we helped with solar energy, making sure they're rainwater harvesting, but really that they're resilient for the shocks that could come in the future. So I think that's also a very important part of it.
And bringing up training and exercising is a great one. I think during the pandemic, people didn't want to train and exercise around preparedness and response because they were responding themselves in their own communities and families, right? So it's important to bring that back in. It's a core of what we all do, but yeah, definitely something that's important to pick back up and keep moving. Pepper, how about Duke Energy?
I'll borrow a term that Jonathan used, pre-positioning. I think about there's a real opportunity in our industry to increase the coordination that we have and communication we have with our county and our city leaders early on when they're thinking about, for example, where the city wants to build an emergency shelter, or where they're thinking about putting an emergency operations center. If we coordinate, I think, early on the front end, they can look to where our infrastructure is, how they can leverage the existing infrastructure, and then we can see if there are any built-in resiliency gaps or opportunities that would be mutually beneficial for the community.
Mayor Constant?
I think it's interesting to listen to everybody who sits here with me, but I think, quite frankly, if we could just get FEMA money, pre-disaster mitigation money, grants known as BRIC, closer and more accessible to communities like the city of Gretna and every other community in this country that's susceptible to some type of disaster, it makes their job easier. She just mentioned pre-positioning. For us, it's that. It's pre-disaster mitigation. Pre-disaster mitigation is a lot less expensive than recovery. Recovery work, I know all of these individuals are involved in after disasters, but recovery work, and all of you here know that, how expensive recovery is. We've lived through it. It's crazy. I get here because in 2005, I was sworn in as a councilwoman in the city of Gretna. 6 weeks later, Katrina hit, and the world changed. And it was crazy to live through a disaster without any preparation to that magnitude, because we didn't have the wherewithal at that time and the knowledge that we have today relative to emergency response, disaster mitigation, resilience. All of these things that we talk about today, at least in local government, we talk about it every day in the state of Louisiana. But what have we changed? In 2018, I placed an application for a grant under FMA and BRIC. FMA, we were successful with FMA. We, in 2020, received a letter of intent to fund. In 2023, we're still not funded. We've expended, in a small budget, close to $1 million to take a chance on a $14 million project. Now, as an elected official, you want to put projects on the ground. You want to meet the needs of the community at the highest level you can, and you want to respond to the people that lived through Katrina, right? As if we've learned something from that. I don't want to repeat that as long as I sit in the seat I'm in today. So I think it's clear. It's pre-disaster mitigation. We've got to get the red tape out of the process. We've got to be able to be, as government agencies, more responsive to local government, because the mayors of this country are the closest people is the closest elected body to the people, and we hear the needs of the people. I want to be able to change building codes so that the houses that are built are better prepared to withstand the next Katrina. We want to raise the elevation of the houses so that we're better prepared. It takes money. It's called pre-mitigation disaster work, and we want to be able to do that work at the local level. Mayors on the Mississippi, we approach this in much the same way about the river itself. And we work collaboratively with, like I said earlier, 104 of us, all having the same conversations about what does our disasters look like? What do our emergencies look like? And there are many different in the way they look, much different. More water here, not so much here, very different. But when we come together collectively for the focus of a reason, in our case, it's one river, the health and economics of that river. And when we do that together, it's extraordinary the things we've been able to accomplish. We can take that model and use it in many different ways. And if the agencies could understand, if we could just come together to get this money more rapidly to local communities, we are the people that can get things done in a quicker timeline than maybe even at the state level can, because of what we know goes on in that process, right? So it's clear to me, and I just appreciate the people that are up here with me in the corporate world, the nonprofit world. But for nonprofits, we would not have recovered from Katrina even the way we did, because the government process was non-existent. We can't repeat that. I mean, we've got to have a better plan in place. And every day and every agency that we have to go into to get to the next level in the process just eats up years at this point. We need projects on the ground. We've got money. We were told, we were in the White House office today, money that hasn't been spent because the applications didn't come in the number that they anticipated. It's because most of them are being thrown out. I know the process we've had with our with the FMA grant. I mean, we've gone through 2 modelings of our community. We've gone through 2 different iterations of the BCA. We've gone through engineering 3 times to get to the possibility of a project on the ground. It needs to be different.
So one of the common threads I'm hearing about that mitigation and resilience phase 2 is being able to come together, right? And the collaborations you've talked about. And with that, we're going to keep everybody on time. And I want to say that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation has been such a great platform and continues to be to bring the federal government in with philanthropy, with energy sector, and with finance, and with our supply chain groups and government, local and state government, in such a really wonderful way. So I want to give a big thanks to our hosts, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, and these amazing panelists today talking about how it really gets done. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe.